Lord, you have given the Bible to be the revelation of your great love for us and of your power and will to save us. Grant that our study of it might not be made in vain by the callousness or the carelessness of our hearts, but that we might wisely hear your words, note, learn, and inwardly digest them so that we might become mature, convinced, and convincing followers of Christ Jesus. Amen.
Amen.
This morning we are going to be looking at the parable, the story, that Alex read for us a moment ago. It's in Luke 12, 13 through 21, and it is commonly called the parable of the rich fool. The parable of the rich fool. But as you think about that, the rich fool, it seems a little bit on the unusual side because how can somebody be foolish and rich, right? If you think about it. How can you possibly be foolish and rich? No one is going to make a television series called The Lifestyles of the Rich and Stupid because it would not be believable. Well, but I mean, in our thinking, isn't rich by definition a sign of wisdom? Isn't calling someone rich a sign of success? Aren't we saying that when somebody is rich that they've been blessed by God? Now, people in the ancient world, in Jesus' day, they certainly believe that. And we pretty much accept it today as well. Those who have more are smart. They have more because they are smart. Right? They have figured out, they're smart enough to figure out how to work the system and get what they want out of it because bigger is always better. You've seen the AT&T commercial, right? You know, the kids are sitting around the table and the man's having this discussion about numbers with them. And, you know, they start tossing around what's the biggest number they can think of. And, you know, some kid says 100 and then another one says 10. Everyone looks at him and glares at him like, you are really out of it, aren't you? Then, you know, somebody else says, well, infinity. Then the next kid along says, infinity plus 1. And then the next kid says, well, I can top that, infinity plus infinity. And then some snarky girl says, well, infinity times infinity. I mean, it gets pretty silly along there. And the tagline is, this is so indicative of how we think. The tagline is, it's not complicated, bigger is better. And then it says AT&T has the largest 4G network. I mean, that's just a little extra tag in there. But bigger is better. Now, of course, that really doesn't matter so much if you don't care about having 4G service, right? Or if you don't, like Dennis. Dennis doesn't care about having 4G service. Dennis does not even take his cell phone with him wherever he goes. When he goes to the airport. I mean, we're picking on Dennis. He doesn't care about phones. So bigger is better doesn't matter to him. But if you travel a lot and you're working the cell phone, you always think, well, I want to have the bigger network. I want to have the bigger and the best kind of a telephone. In American thinking, bigger is always better. That's just the way we think. You know, bigger houses, bigger garages to house all the stuff that we collect, bigger jobs, bigger hamburgers, bigger pizzas, bigger credentials, bigger 401k plans, bigger contributions by your employer to your 401k plan, bigger barns, because bigger is always going to be better in the way that we think. However, Jesus challenges that idea, right? In the passage that we just read, Jesus challenges that idea. Luke 12:13. Someone from the crowd said to Jesus, "Teacher," or Rabbi, "tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me." Now right up to that point, Jesus has been talking with a rather large, bigger crowd. Verse 1 of chapter 12 says that there were thousands upon thousands of people. And he had been talking about his identity as the Son of Man, or the Common English Bible says the human one, which is actually a great rendering of the idea of the Son of Man, because the Son of Man means the ultimate man, the ultimate human, the one who is truly everything that there possibly is about being a human being. That's what the Son of Man means. It is the human, the man. And Jesus is challenging these people to acknowledge him for who he is, as the human one, the Son of Man. Then just a few minutes into it, somebody in the crowd jumps into the conversation with what appears to be this rather random comment, kind of non sequitur. Just you're listening to this and you're thinking, well, why did this guy say this? "Teacher, tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me." And you're reading this and you're thinking, well, what does that have to do with the price of eggs in China? Well, of course it has everything to do with it. For in the ancient Judea, rabbis were often called upon to adjudicate legal or family disputes, problems. And by requesting that Jesus intervene in this situation, that he solve the problem, which apparently was a big problem in their family, the man is acknowledging Jesus as an authority figure. He's saying, "You are a real rabbi." And apparently there was some disagreement about the family inheritance, and the man saw Jesus as someone who could dish out solid justice for them. So you're reading this and he's going, well, wait a minute, what's going on here? This is not exactly what Jesus had in mind when he was talking about being the Son of Man, the human one, or the importance of acknowledging him as this kind of authority figure. He says, this isn't what I'm talking about. If you look at verse 14, Jesus said to him, "Man, who appointed me as judge or referee between you and your brother?" Huh? I mean, this was a great opportunity for Jesus to demonstrate his wit and his wisdom. This was a great opportunity for Jesus to prove himself to the crowd. Instead, without even hearing this man's the facts in this guy's case, Jesus calls out the man and maybe even is calling out the crowd, suggesting, implying that the request might be rooted in greed, which pretty much characterizes the motivation behind the crowd's infatuation with Jesus, and dare we say, perhaps even our own infatuation with Jesus. Everyone is trying to get ahead in life, right? And if you can get a really good lucky charm like Jesus on your side, well, think of the possibilities. Think of the business possibilities. You know, if Jesus is from God, and if you can say all the right things and do all the right things to keep Jesus happy, then that should guarantee business success or family success or the inheritance success coming your direction or personal success. Imagine what you could get out of this deal if you had Jesus working for you. And it's this kind of thinking that Jesus is challenging here as you read between the lines of the parable. Look at verse 15. Then Jesus said to them, "Watch out, guard yourself against all kinds of greed. After all, one's life is not determined by one's possessions, even when someone is very wealthy." Then he told them a parable. A certain rich man's land produced a bountiful crop. Notice he doesn't say that the man produced a bountiful crop. It just says the land produced a bountiful crop. And he said to himself, what will I do? I have no place to store my harvest. And then he thought, genius that I am. Here's what I'll do. I will tear down my barns and I will build bigger ones. And here's the bigger is better thing, the theme again. That's where I'll store all of my grain and my goods. Verse 19, I'll say to myself, self, you should listen to me. You've stored up plenty of goods, enough for several years. Take it easy. Eat, drink, enjoy yourself. But God said to him, verse 20, fool, tonight you will die. Now who will get the things that you have prepared for yourself? This is the way that it will be for those who hoard things for themselves and are not rich toward God. Now most people who are in this crowd hearing this thing, or even in our crowd hearing this thing, are thinking, hoarding? I'm not into hoarding. I mean, if you look at my garage, you might think I am, but it's not all my stuff. I mean, it's my children's stuff and a few other guys' stuff that's in there. I'm not into hoarding, you know. Yeah, I may be trying to build a bigger barn, but it's not because I'm hoarding. I'm just trying to manage. Yeah. I mean, what should I do? Should I just leave that crop out there in the field where it will waste away? Or the gleaners will come along and they will get the benefit of my enterprise? I'm not rich enough to do that. I'm not even rich, if you think about it. I read the results of a very interesting survey this week. It was published in the UBS Investors Weekly, or UBS Investor Watch. And it seems that 72% of all Americans who have stockpiled between $1 million and $5 million do not actually consider themselves to be wealthy. If you ask them, a millionaire who has between $1 and $5 million will say, I'm not wealthy. And that kind of explains a lot. They are, in their minds, just struggling to keep their heads above the water, and $1 million is not enough to live a comfortable and a secure life, so they need to go bigger in their thinking. They need to get ahead, and they need to get some security. So outrageous generosity is for those who can afford it. Bill Gates, Warren Buffett, but not for us little millionaires. Because, you know, if you think about it, $1 million is not enough, right? I mean, how many of you millionaires, you know, can't get by on $1 million? But can you see where this line of thinking is going? They are not in their minds hoarding, they are just trying to survive. Now, of course, in our thinking, we do reach a point where we are able to free ourselves and say, okay, well, I need to enjoy the fruit of my labor. And, you know, where you can, like a farmer of means, say to yourself, take it easy, eat, drink, and enjoy yourself. But is that hoarding, really, when you think about it? That's not hoarding, to enjoy yourself, is it? Is it selfish to enjoy the blessings of God? At what point is it okay to say, self, Brad, take it easy, eat, drink, and enjoy yourself, build bigger barns for everything you've got. Now, of course, Jesus' interest in pointing out how subtle and not so subtle greed filters in, gets into our lives, and gets in the way of embracing his kingdom living and his kingdom agenda. That's what he's trying to get at. He's trying to get people to see that greed gets in the way. And really, there is nothing inherently evil about being well off. But there's just something about being well off that more times than not distracts us from being rich toward God. And if you follow along in the remainder of Luke 12, you'll see that it is focused on putting riches into perspective, putting money, mammon, into perspective. So for example, if you start at verse 28, if God dresses grass in the field so beautifully, even though it's alive today and tomorrow it's thrown into the furnace, how much more will God do for you, you people of weak faith? Don't chase after what you will eat and what you will drink. Stop worrying. All the nations of the world long for these things. Your Father knows that you need them. Instead, he says, desire his kingdom, and these things will be given to you as well. Verse 32, don't be afraid, little flock, because your Father delights in giving you the kingdom. So then he says, so sell your possessions and give to those in need. Make for yourselves wallets that don't wear out, a treasure in heaven that never runs out. No thief comes near there, and no moth destroys. Where your treasure is, your heart will be also. And we're going to be working on that passage next Sunday, but just throw that out there for you to chew on this week. But for this morning, I really want to stick with this bigger barns issue for just a few more moments and kind of flip this whole thing around and kind of back into the barn, so to speak, hoping that by going in that way, from that angle, Jesus' message will become even clearer to us. Now that we've heard Jesus slam the barn door, we need to be asking ourselves, when is it possible, when is it okay then to build bigger barns? And I want to offer three suggestions. Really, they're conversation starters, because I'm thinking that no one is really going to be hearing Jesus if his message is presented as some kind of frontal attack on what we hold to be true and what we hold to be dear, which it is. And I'm not saying that we don't deserve this kind of frontal attack, but just maybe we'll hear it all the more clearly and we'll take it all the more personally if we have it in the form of questions. So I want to give you three questions to ask that should help you clarify in your hearts and your minds when building bigger barns is okay. All right? Three questions for knowing when to build a bigger barn, whether it's all right to do so. So the first question to ask when faced with the possibility of personal expansion is number one is, how will my bigger barn be a channel of mercy to my neighbor? How will my bigger barn be a channel of mercy to my neighbors? Or to frame it in a slightly different way, will a bigger barn contribute to the well-being of my neighbors, especially those in need? I mean, in Luke 10, we heard that read a few weeks ago. Luke 10, which is just 2 chapters earlier than Luke 12, Jesus tells the story of the Good Samaritan in response to the question, who is my neighbor? So who can give us a quick summary of that parable? Parable of the Good Samaritan. Who's got a quick? You don't know it. Or you just can't do it quickly, right? Go ahead, Matt.
Someone who does something good for others without having to think about it.
Okay, that's kind of how you see it as a point of it, all right? Well, there was this man, he was on the road to Jericho, and it says in the Bible, in Jesus' story says that he got attacked by thieves, bandits, robbers. They beat him up. They left him sitting on the side of the road to die. And along comes a Jewish religious guy, kind of higher up in the system. And he sees the man standing on the side, or lying on the side, and he goes around and and goes on his way. Which, by the way, if you know the story, if you know anything about it, that's what he was supposed to do. Because because of his position, he couldn't defile himself by being around a potentially dead body. So he does what he's supposed to do. Then there's a second very religious person comes along and he does exactly the same thing. He's not going to defile himself by getting involved with this thing. But then there's a third guy that comes along and he happens to be a what? Samaritan, right? And Samaritan were the scum of the earth. They were the worst of worst people. They were the people that were not cool religiously. They just didn't do all the right stuff, and they were very questionable people. But the Samaritan, he stops and he puts this guy on his donkey and takes him to the ER and pays for him to have a couple of days stay there and goes on his way. And then at the end of the parable, Jesus says, so who do you think is the one that gets it? And everyone says, well, of course, it's the Samaritan, much to their chagrin. And Jesus says, yeah, it's the one who shows mercy. There's a principle of mercy that transcends all of this other stuff. All of the other rules, all of the other laws, all of the other regulations. Mercy transcends it. So, the point is that the real neighbor is the one who shows mercy to those who are in need. Thus, mercy has got to be primary to the agenda of anyone who is a follower of Jesus. The principle of mercy that transcends legal privileges, legal rights, and even legal obligations. So, how is this related to the bigger barn issue? In the ancient world, the welfare system relied on two things. The first was the extended family or the extended clan, and in a less mobile world than what we have, families and clans always lived close by each other, so people were expected to take care of their relatives who had fallen on hard times, even their weird relatives. You know, even your crazy uncle, you were still responsible for that person. And then secondly, those who had means were expected to provide for those who did not have means, even if they were not in your family. And even if they were aliens, like Ruth. The story of Ruth and Boaz, you remember that? Ruth, this week, go read Ruth 1 through 4. You know, she gleans in Boaz's field, and it works out great. So if you were a landowner farmer, it was expected that you would not maximize your farming practices, nor would you completely harvest your fields. But you would always, always, always leave enough in your fields so that those who were less fortunate, who did not own land, that they would be able to glean from the field after your harvest, and that they would be able to make a good living out of doing that. That was the understanding. And if you had a bumper crop that year, you would be able to leave even more in the fields for everyone else. You would not be building bigger barns to stockpile a fortune for yourself, but you would see the blessing of a great crop as a mandate to bless the poor. That was considered fair. After all, where did it all come from to begin with, right? Is it because you're some kind of farming genius? Or that you worked harder than the rest of humanity to make this possible? No. God sent you good weather, and God gave you good health so that you could work the field, and it's all a gift. That's your orientation. It's all a gift from God. So you are obligated, socially even, you are obligated to pass that kind of gift along. You are obligated to be generous. Warren Buffett is certainly the most successful investor of the 20th century. and he is one of the richest men in the world. This week, I looked it up, he is worth $53.5 billion. He owns See's Candy. If I were a billionaire, I would buy See's Candy. I mean, you know you're rich when you can buy the candy store, right? But he lives in a modest Nebraska house that he bought in 1958 for $31,500. And he drives a modest car. And he has been known to use public transportation. And he plays the ukulele. He does. Not bad either. I mean, this guy is awesome. I mean, that's really the hallmark of awesomeness right there. Warren Buffett is also one of the great philanthropists of all time, and he believes that wealth is more a matter of luck than work, and that we shouldn't treat it so personally. The wealthy should be willing to pay more in taxes for the opportunities that have come their way randomly. And then they should also be crazy generous. Not his words, but that's what he means. His goal in his life is to give away his fortune by the time he dies. And he once said, "My luck was accentuated by my living in a market system that sometimes produces distorted results, though overall it serves our country well. I've worked in an economy that rewards someone who saves the lives of others on a battlefield with a medal, rewards a great teacher with thank you notes from parents, but rewards those who can detect the mispricing of securities with sums reaching into the billions. In short," he says, "fate's distribution of long straws is wildly capricious." So if Warren Buffett, an agnostic billionaire, who sees things in terms of impersonal fate and luck, treats each decision in light of this long-term potential for blessing others, how much more so should it be for those who see the world as a creation of a personal God who has a vested sovereign interest in the well-being of all people and the planet itself? If I build a bigger barn, will it in any way negatively impact the well-being of my neighbors who are relying on that gleaned wheat that I'm now stockpiling for a profit? Is my bigger barn going to have a negative environmental impact on my children's 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 children? Those present, those who are coming. How will my bigger barn then be a channel of mercy to my neighbors? That's a Jesus question. Second question. Am I banking on this bigger barn for my security? Am I banking on this bigger barn for my security? Is it not the greatest of ironies that we have "In God We Trust" printed on our money? It's mostly a misrepresentation, if not a lie. It should say, "In God we trust, but." But not so much that we're going to hold lightly onto these greenbacks. Because once I get them, I'm going to accumulate them. When it comes to the economy, we run around like Chicken Little, or chickens after their heads have been chopped off. We are pathetic. It's almost as though we enjoy the crisis mode. We want to be in the midst of this crisis, that somehow if we feel like we are panicked enough, we'll be able to realign the universe, or at least that we'll feel significant in it. This is affecting me. I mean, this must be a big crisis. It has an impact on me. Remember Tevye in Fiddler on the Roof? Do you remember him? You know Fiddler on the Roof, right? You've seen that? The musical or the movie? In the movie, someone says to him, You know, money is the world's curse. To which he responds, yeah, he says, may the Lord smite me with it, may I never recover. The fault is not in the possessions themselves, but in how tightly we cling to them or how we use them. And the pursuit of possessions is not just an issue for the wealthy. The poor can be just as consumed with singing, if I were a rich man, right? But generally speaking, the more we have, the more passionate we become about our possessions. The more reliant on them we become. The more we look to them for our sense of security. As Jesus says in 12:34, where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. So if you've got a big treasure, you're going to have a big heart toward money. So that's the problem with hoarding. Verse 21. This is the way it will be for those who hoard things for themselves. Now, sometimes we use the word hoarding to describe a mental illness or disorder where people compulsively save everything. Jesus, however, is more basic in his understanding, using hoarding to describe the collection of resources for self-interest, specifically as a way to enhance one's own one's own position in life. And the problem with hoarding isn't just that it deprives others, but that it provides a false sense of security. If I accumulate enough, if I get comfortable enough, well then I will have it made and everything important in life will be covered. Except, the problem with that is that it's not true. It doesn't work that way in the Jesus economy, and ultimately we all eventually find out that it's his economy that counts in the end anyway. And that leads right into the third question. Am I building bigger barns with eternity in mind? Am I building bigger barns with eternity in mind? Do I have God's long-term perspective in mind and in perspective of me and the world in mind when I'm pouring resources into this kind of expansion? Again, while bigger isn't always better, bigger isn't always wrong either. I mean, if God leads us to build a bigger barn so we can house a school for special needs children who are falling through the cracks, that is an investment with eternity in mind. If God leads us to create a business so that we can pay for ministry, that is an investment with eternity in mind. The farmer in the parable who built the bigger barn, however, was short-sighted. That's where I'll store all my grain and goods, and I'll say to myself, you have stored up plenty of goods, enough for years, and take it easy, eat, drink, enjoy yourself. But then God said to him, fool, or actually he probably said, fool, tonight you will die. Now, who's going to get all that stuff you prepared for yourself? This is the way that it will be for those who hoard things for themselves and aren't rich toward God. And aren't rich toward God. We spend our lives trying to build a sizable nest egg, and then poof, life as we know it is gone. The time is short. You think that you have years ahead. How many years do you think you have left? Anyone want to guess? 20? 5? How many years do you think you have left?
40.
X, yeah, oh, I like it. How many years do you think that you have left? Well, you're wrong. Whatever it is. Poof, life as you know it is gone. The point is the time is short. And maybe you have a few years left, but maybe you don't. And even when you do have a few years left, in the overall scheme of things, it's just short. The end is closer than you think that it is. Klein Snodgrass, and I put this quote on the message guide. He's a great down-to-earth New Testament scholar at North Park. He wrote, "Those who store up for themselves instead of storing up in relation to God are like prosperous fools who have no opportunity to enjoy their prosperity. So, therefore, invest with eternity in mind. That is the kingdom of God, the Jesus agenda. Become rich towards God. That's what Jesus is really saying here. Become rich toward God. I really like that phrase at the end of verse 21, rich toward God. Pour all of your energy and your passions into building up the heavenly bank account. As Jesus says in verse 33, which we will talk about later, sell your possessions and give to those in need. Make for yourselves wallets that don't wear out. A treasure in heaven that never runs out, where no thief can come and no moth can destroy it. Whatever it is that you're building, make sure that you are becoming rich toward God. So here's the key point this morning. It's a long key point this morning, but it just kind of covers it all. So if you want to follow along, it's on the message guide. Rich fools miss out on life by acting as though everything hinges on possessions. In contrast, those who live full, fruitful lives are those who are rich toward God, living as though everything hinges on the matters that are important to God. Did you get it all there? You got it. It's on the test. George W. Truett, was a bigger-than-life pastor in Texas in the first part of the 20th century. I think he died in about 1944. And he was a Texan. I mean, everything about him was Texan big. You know, and he was once invited to dinner at the home of a very wealthy man. And he was the pastor of First Baptist Church of Dallas, which at that time was probably the biggest church in the country. And after the meal, the host led him to a place where they could get a good view of the surrounding area. And pointing to the oil wells out in one direction, he boasted and said, 25 years ago, put on your best Texan accent, 25 years ago I had nothing. Now as far as you can see, it's all mine. Then looking back in the opposite direction at these sprawling fields of grain, he said, and that's all mine. Then turning east toward these huge herds of longhorn cattle, he boasted, those are all mine. And then pointing to the south to this beautiful forest, and there are some awfully nice looking forests in Texas, he bragged, and that's all mine too. And then he kind of paused for a moment, expecting that Dr. Truett would compliment him on his great success in life. But the pastor walked up to him and put one hand on his shoulder and took the other hand, and he pointed up and he said, and how much do you have in the other direction, that direction? And the wealthy man said, I've never thought about it like that before. And I think a lot of us don't ever think about it like that before. So at the risk of sounding hokey, how much do you have in that direction? Are you growing richer toward God? Because in the end, that is the only thing that matters. Let's pray. Merciful God, we're messed up. We've been climbing the ladder of success only to discover that there is nothing of significance up there. Help us to start moving in a new direction so that we become rich in you. That you become the sole purpose and focus for our lives. Destroy all that gets in the way of that, even if it's painful. So that we are fully invested in you instead of the barns we're building for ourselves. We trust you. not taking any of this lightly, for we know that you sent your one and only Son to die for us, wiping out our debt to death and snapping the back of evil, freeing us to follow him into the resurrection life. Here this morning then, right now, tomorrow, this week, and into the rest of eternity, we trust him. And we thank you and receive your gift of new life.